Um, so just to introduce a little bit, I see a lot of people who have registered for the webinar, and in fact, we are about 100 participants who have joined today. I see a lot of familiar names, and I also have conversed with some of you in the past few days leading towards the webinar. But for those who I haven't ran into in the past in a conference or on an email, as Jonathan and Paul said, my name is Stefan Aquilina, and I'm the director of the School of Performing Arts of the University of Malta. In reality, the school that I represent and its Department of Theatre Studies has quite a history already with the S-Word, the project that Paul was talking about. In fact, we have been partners since 2018, and last year, this school has hosted the symposium Stanislavsky in Context, which I'm sure some of you at least attended. As you can imagine, I was honored last August that I was offered to co-direct the Stanislavsky Research Center, which is now being hosted between Malta and Leeds. And I look forward, of course, to continue working with Jonathan and with Paul and with the fantastic group of people on the board of the center as we keep exploring Stanislavsky and as we keep exploring Stanislavsky and his relevance to contemporary actor training and performance. The webinar today is the first, as we said, of a series of seminars that we will be holding this coming academic year. And I think it is very clear that we are responding to current needs, to current difficulties, which we are all experiencing at the moment, where we all had to extend our online presence. We had to extend our online presence when it comes to research and finding ways of disseminating our research, but also, perhaps more crucially, in relation to teaching. And in view of this, we have two fantastic speakers who today will be talking to us specifically on this area, which is teaching Stanislavsky online. And the two speakers are Stephanie Daventry French, who is a professor of theater at East Stroudsburg University in Pennsylvania, and David Shirley, who is the executive director of the Western Australian Academy of Performing Arts in Perth, Australia. Just some housekeeping before we start. So each presentation will be about 20 minutes, which will leave us some time for questions at the end. Any questions, please put them in the question and answer portal at the bottom of the screen so that I can sort of monitor a little bit the questions that are coming in. Now, to introduce more formally Stephanie, our first speaker. So Stephanie French heads the acting for theater, TV and film and directing tracks at East Stroudsburg University, where her most recent directing includes The Tempest, Smart People, The 39 Steps, and The Crucible, amongst many others. Her book, written with Philip Bennett, Experiencing Stanislavsky Today, Training and Rehearsal for the Psychophysical Actor, links acting technique to yoga and contemporary cognitive science. Stephanie's presentation is titled Psychophysical Actor Training for the Small Screen. Stephanie?
Right. Hello, everybody, and welcome from around the world. Since we're talking about how to get connected in our bodies on the screen, I just want to start. I'm going to stand up, and I invite you to stand up wherever you are. We can't see you. I'm going to, and just since we're afraid of breath right now because of this crazy pandemic we're all living through, but in this safe space of the small screen, we can breathe together. And I'm asking you to take 3 breaths with me. We'll inhale and move your hand up the center line of your body, and exhale and release it down, and just feel your feet firmly planted on the ground and your head moving up towards your ceiling, so that you're really extending between at least those 2 points and your arm as the 3rd point. And so all together now, allow the breath to fall in and release out, and fall in and release out, and one more time. Okay, I just wanted to do that as a start. I thought it's nice to breathe together, even if we can't be in the same space. All right, so I'm gonna turn into a PowerPoint, and you can still see the speakers on the side, I guess, or however you want to do that. Okay, so, okay, all right. Not sure why it's jumping around. There we go. Okay, so the presentation is on psychophysical actor training for the small screen. And like so many of you, I have been teaching on the small screen. We moved online mid-semester in spring semester, so around March of last year, taught there until the end of that semester, and have been fully online for fall. And we will already know that we will be fully online for spring semesters. I teach in the United States where things are insane at the moment with COVID. I also just finished filming. I worked with a group of actors to write an original screenplay. We took a month to write a screenplay, and we just finished filming it, and we are now in the process of editing. So, all right. Sorry, it's moving faster than I wish. Okay. Okay, so I like to give honor to my legacy. It's from the oral tradition. I didn't learn the system from books until much later, but originally I learned it from the oral tradition through Stanislavsky to Vakhtangov, to Sonia Moore, to Philip Bennett, who's actually on this call, and then to me. And yeah, this is just, I wanted to take a breath because breath connects directly to some of the key things about acting for us, which is inspiration and the idea of imparting a truth through our work that we're trying to always do. So basically what I've done since I moved online to online teaching is I thought, you know, most of our students want to work in television and in film as well as in theater. And so why not take this opportunity where we're sort of forced into this screen acting to direct their acting towards acting for television and film, with the idea that we can scale it up later for the theater. Because we do that anyway. We train them for the theater and then we scale it down for the screen, and there's no reason we can't also work the other way. As all of you that are teachers know, and all of you that are actors know, the basic tenets of acting are the same in both mediums. So I wanted to just bring up this famous drawing of Stanislavsky that came late in his work as he really started to try to pull it all together. And I just think that it's very interesting that as he pulled the different aspects of the system together, and I'm going to give you one with the translation from my colleague Philip Bennett from the Russian. So this will be on the website. It's very small to look at right now, perhaps, but when it's on the website, you can blow it up and look at it in more detail. I just think it's very interesting that when he wanted to describe his system in one visual image, he chose an image that very much relates to the human body. And when I saw this image, the first thing I thought about with it, besides the lungs, which I think are pretty obvious, and I know that he was working so much with the central nervous system and trying to use these two things to activate on cue an actor. But I also think it's very interesting that he put these other things along the spine, which I'll be talking about today. And for me, I immediately saw a connection to the chakras from yoga. I grew up with a mother as a yoga teacher, so I learned yoga very early. And when I started learning the system, I immediately saw the connections to yoga, which I didn't know actually were true until much later, until I was exposed to Sharon Carnecky's work and letting me know that, in fact, the system was pretty entirely based on the psychophysical aspect of it, based on yoga. So I think that I look at a couple things. Psychophysical conditioning is paramount before we get into anything else. And so we have to develop the lungs. We have to, we can borrow from yoga, from pranayama. Certainly every aspect of our vocal training develops your facility with breath. And later in your acting, you really need to learn how to connect the breath to what you're doing. So we can certainly work with that online. Sorry, I keep jumping because I touched my screen. Let me go back. Okay, here we go. So I also think we're always working with the nervous system. One of the most important ways, and we can certainly do that online, I like to think instead of focusing, imagination obviously is key to acting, and imagination is key to acting for the camera as well. But we can also, even though we're not directly communicating sensorily with our audience, we can use what I call sensory recreation. So that instead of using the term imagination, I like to use the term sensory recreation, where we create the world that we are inhabiting, the world of the character's world, through all of our senses, okay? And as you get moving on in your various movement training, you will get to a point where you not only can direct your energy, but you begin to become aware of which part of the body is activated, and you can develop an awareness to the level of being aware of which chakra is activated for different things. So it can be activated by a trigger that the character is experiencing. It can be activated by your own mind as well. Okay, so then my other thing about this time period is that instead of going bigger, we can go deeper, because we can't go bigger right now. But if we go deeper, we have more fuel for when we want to go bigger later, that we can expand that out. We have the content for it. So I always start my work with actors online with some sort of tuning in that involves breathing or meditation together. And then I do a few exercises. I borrow a lot from yoga since I have that background. You know, you certainly could borrow from any martial arts that you know, any dance that you know. And we have a bunch, Phil and I have a bunch of exercises in our book as well that begin to make these psychophysical connections. So I always also ask the actors, because of the wanting to have that communication going on between the mind and the body, I always get us to work with awakening the spine in some way. I find some of the best exercises for this are twists. I do a series of arm swings that just starting at hip height, moving to waist height, moving to chest height. You can allow the hands to kind of hit your body, which comes from Qigong, a kind of stimulation of the body. But the important thing is getting the spine to become more articulate all up the levels. Obviously, the old classic theater, rolling up the spine, stacking one vertebrae on top of the other exercise is excellent. And then I find it very helpful too to get people more alert with various sensory recreation types of exercises. All right, so the other thing though is to get this to be really psychophysical is that we need to connect the mind to the body, and that helps by bringing it into the given circumstances, whether they're from a play or whether these are given circumstances that you are imagining to connect an exercise to given circumstances to make it psychophysical. So now I want to lead into a little demonstration. I had some actors do a video so I can demonstrate an exercise to you. So this term, the anatomy of thought, comes from my colleague Phil Bennett, and I'll talk about where that led from him. So the question is, how do we follow the subtle movement of a sensory trigger into thought, and then how do we trace that trigger through from our mind and into our body? How do we express it through action? How do we lead each audience member through this journey too, so they can experience it? So one of the things I feel really strongly about is that I'm not looking for actors to just emote in general. I'm looking for them to emote in response to specific triggers that they have lined up through the role, through the journey of the character, so that we are leading our audience through the journey of the character moment by moment. And so I want to introduce an exercise that I know a lot of people are not familiar with. It was originally created by Sonia Moore. She was inspired by some of the musings of Aristotle. And she described it in this way. So we call the exercise wed gag, and W means wonder, and E, evaluate, D, decide, gesture, act, gesture. And it will make more sense, I think, just for me to demonstrate this exercise. So pardon me while I stop sharing this screen and I go to sharing another screen where I can give you the exercise. Okay. Called WEDGAG, which stands for wonder, evaluate, decision, and that decision has a gesture that expresses what that decision feels like. And then we make an action, in this case, to look at or not look at your lover's journal. And then you can take your time to either read it or decide not to read it. And then there's a final gesture of, was that a good idea or not? I've now broken their trust, or I've not, or I chose not to break their trust and I put it back, whatever you decide. Okay, so we're going through the sequence. So you've got your journal, your lover's journal's on the table, and we're gonna just come up from as though we've just walked into the space and we discover it. You can walk in if you want to. Okay, you can walk in from off screen. And I'll talk you through the sequence, and you discover it. So that is the moment of wonder first. And then evaluate. Let that all go through your spine. Is it a good idea or not? Should I look at it? Should I not? And at some point in that evaluation, you're going to make a decision. Let that decision be a clear moment and have a gesture. And then act. Go to that journal. Even once again, you're evaluating. Should I open it? Should I not? Am I going to do this? Am I going to violate their privacy? Am I going to let it go? Remember, we decided there's something wrong going on in your relationship and you really want to know. So let those things be at war. And then decide either to look or not to look. And then let's have a final gesture before you walk out of the frame again of whether that was a good idea or not. So you can either put it down or walk out of the frame with it and decide whether that was a good idea or not. Okay, great. And come back. And this time we're going to do it one more time. And just want to remind you that the steps are, you discover it, which is where you just, it's a moment of wonder or discovery. And then you evaluate, and then you decide and let that be reflected in a gesture through the small, subtle muscles on your spine and through your spine. And then you act in some way, and then you have a final gesture that expresses whether that was a good thing or not, okay? So do your best to remember as many of those steps as possible. After a lot of training, these steps become second nature, and you don't need to really think about them. They're just always happening, okay? So when you're ready, go ahead and begin and go through the whole sequence. Okay, come on back. All right, I'm going to come back to sharing the PowerPoint with you. So you can, those actors were Abigail Witt and Jamil Joseph, so thanks to them. And I just want to note that you can add WEDGAG into your verbal and nonverbal training improvisations, all the action improvisations that you might do based on Stanislavsky's work. You can add WEDGAG to all of them if you train it early. I usually find that doing a simple one, such as to sit in a chair first, and then creating circumstances around that, having the actors come up with their own circumstances about why they shouldn't or should sit in the chair, is a good starting place. And then you can add it to any kind of improv after that. So I train in the psychophysical conditioning, and then we get into verbal and nonverbal action improvs. I'm finding they're working just great online. And then when I do scene work with the students, I do active analysis with them online, and I get them to do it with each other in their meetings, which may take place through FaceTime or Zoom or some other medium as well. So WEDGAG is a good basis for acting with the camera, and so is another technique called telling the novel, which I'll just go over very, very quickly, but I won't be demonstrating.
You have about 2 to 3 minutes left.
Okay,
Stephanie.
thank you, Stefan. So basically, this will be on the website, so I'm gonna have to rush through it a little bit, but you can clarify the given circumstances. I find it helpful to mark the beats before you do this exercise, and then to identify the character's need, the problem they're struggling with, and the desired solution, and get them thinking about the magic if, and then to work actively on their feet. So usually what I do is I demo using a couple of actors, and I really talk them through the whole exercise in front of the class for others, using Zoom to spotlight the actors that I'm working with. And then I have them work within a 10 by 10 space if they can create that around their computers, have all the props. And they should work only 2 to 3 beats at a time, maximum 1 page. I personally break down telling the novel into 3 parts. Step 1 is working with inner dialogue. And basically they say the inner dialogue, and then they say the line. And then the second part is they just say the line while they're still thinking the inner dialogue. And all the time working with inner dialogue is getting that inner thought to be reflected through the subtle movement of the spine that they've trained in through WEDGAG. So they're working with inner dialogue being reflected through the body. Then I work with tonal subtext as well, which is much more about how they say the line, and yet of course, what they're intending to communicate really affects how they move physically and moves them into action as well. And sometimes actors can come to action more easily through the tonal subtext than they can through the action, or vice versa. But they'll do the same thing. They'll say the tonal subtext and then the line, trying to fulfill what it is they're trying to communicate. And then they'll just say the line and still trying to fulfill what they're trying to communicate. And then the last one, and this will be my last slide, is that they do it with action. So all of you, I'm sure, that work with Stanislavsky work with action, and putting it in the transitive verb form is so helpful to accuse someone, to deny someone. And so then you'll say the action and then the line, and then the other actor says their action and their line, and you do that back and forth. And always when you say the action, you're trying to fulfill it with the line. Then you say only the line, trying to fulfill the action. And then in both the first and this last exercise, I often will take the script away again. So I'll have them say the actions back and forth between the actors, the actions, fulfilling them physically and not saying the lines at all. So forcing them to communicate non-verbally. And you can do the same on the inner monologue exercise, going back to just communicating through the inner monologue, through the language of that inner monologue that they've discovered. Okay. All right, so hopefully that was not too long. And thank you all for being here. And thank you, Stefan, Jonathan, and Paul for hosting us.
Thank you, Stephanie. We can move to David Shirley, our second presentation today. So David Shirley is a professional actor with extensive experience in theater, film, television, and radio. He is actively engaged in promoting research initiatives across the higher education performer training sector. His own research includes published articles and book chapters related to Stanislavsky, British actor and director training, the American method, the work of Samuel Beckett, and post-dramatic theatre. Prior to assuming the role of executive dean at the Western Australian Academy of Performing Arts, David was the director of Manchester School of Theatre at MMU in the UK. His presentation is titled A Slice of Zoom Life, Uta Hagen's Object Exercises in the COVID Era. David?
Thank you very much, Stefan. And hello, everybody from Western Australia. It's a pleasure to be here. And thanks to Jonathan, Stefan, and Paul for enabling this webinar, which is very, very interesting. Actually, quite a lot of what I'm going to talk about marries very, very closely to some of the things that Stephanie was talking about. So I'm going to go straight into it. I'm not going to use any visual aids. I'm just going to talk through it, but I'll be very happy to answer any questions. First of all, this slice of Zoom life really is an adaptation of the work that was developed by Uta Hagen as an interpretation or a method interpretation of Stanislavsky's work, which was taught to Doreen Cannon in the late 1950s and early 1960s at the Royal Court, and which subsequently really started at the Drama Centre, but then spread to a number of the drama schools. I should say at the very beginning that this work anticipates a theatrical-based training, although one could easily adapt it for screen-based training. This is very much about theatre training. So everything I'm saying is talking about theatre. And I think you've all received the notes and the briefing that's given to the students. So I'm not going to spend too much time on that, although I'll happily answer a question of them. First of all, just to say briefly, the aims of the object exercise, or the first object exercise, this is one of 3 that I teach. It's simply the solo object exercise where students create 15 minutes of their own lives. And the aims are to introduce the notion of theatrical truth for them as distinct from actuality or so-called real life. To underline at an early stage some sense of structure, moving from A to B to C with rehearsed material, making it look as though it was spontaneous. It introduces the notion of objectives, superobjectives, activities, and how these relate and interconnect to each other to enable a true connection to the scenic material. It very, very importantly, it introduces the notion of endowment, objects, environment, place, time, given circumstances, imparting qualities to spaces and that maybe don't pertain to the real life events or the actual sensory experience from which they originate, but it invests those inanimate things often, but also animate things with particular qualities. Very importantly also, it nurtures a reflection about space, the real importance of space in theatrical performance, literal space, imaginative space, connotative space. And it's a very, in this first exercise, there's strong encouragement to work from the self, the identity of the actor, his or herself, rather than any sense of fictional character. I just want to talk about this notion of space. A principal aim of this exercise is absolutely to nurture an awareness of space and time so as to stimulate, in a very real sense, the creative and imaginative muscles that are so essential to an actor's craft. Hence the usual requirement when we do it within a studio for students to bring in personal props, furniture, possessions, etc., to personalize a kind of studio space that bears no resemblance to where the activity might be set. And we think of space in different ways: physical, emotional, time-based, literal, imaginative, historical, intellectual, etc. And many of these experiences are triggered by possessions and objects and places that we go and we visit, and they create a kind of emotional, often, response that's essential to actors. The other part about this is that moving this activity onto Zoom, students often feel nervous in this exercise because usually it takes place very much in the early part of the training, and usually there's lots and lots of people sitting and observing the work. And even if you do lose yourself in the world of the theatrical space when it's done in the studio, you always have some awareness of the presence of an audience when it takes place. And there's an interesting development that takes place once you start to move this to Zoom. I have to say, just by way of a sort of setting it up. The way this exercise works, my intuitive response to the COVID situation, all the work I was doing, by the way, was not object exercise. It was all theatre, transformative, reciprocal kind of work, sensory recreation that I was doing in a live studio space with this group of first years at Whopper. But then when we moved to online delivery, I didn't want to sort of drop into a theoretical mode of delivery, as some courses had to sort of front load all the theoretical engagement. I wanted to keep it practical, but it's very hard to do ensemble-based work on Zoom in a kind of meaningful way. So I opted to do these object exercises, thinking that they would sit really, really well in a Zoom place. And to some extent they did. But just talking about Zoom, the choice of activity for these acting situations was, as I said, influenced solely by the emergence of C19. But the portability of the object exercise, where there's no other characters involved and students create their own scenarios, felt really good. And it also meant that students could rehearse and prepare as they usually do, but rather than bring all their belongings into a studio space, and often they get taxis and cars and bring everything in with each other, they could actually present the scenario in the situ where they had been rehearsing them. So how did each session work? Well, the briefing prior to each exercise was the same as it always was. Students are required to rehearse between 45 minutes to an hour for each 15-minute presentation, and to rehearse with rigor and detail, to have a clear objective, a clear super objective, and 3 stress physical activities. And this is where it's very interesting, just looking at your last active analysis, Stephanie. They have to be physical activities, stimulus that live through the body. And the exercise requires students to investigate, rehearse, present segments from their own lives in which they experience what it feels like to be private in public, as if it were here and now. So working private in public as if it were happening spontaneously. So the things that I would say about the benefits of the approach, the rehearsal in their own familiar space, followed by a presentation, very often in the same actual space, afforded a level of authenticity in terms of spatial dynamics that's not available in a studio environment. And one of the byproducts of this is it prompted in the students a feeling of ease and security, the sense that they were not having to do anything artificial. They could be quite naturally in the space. Another advantage was, although the exercise was witnessed, as it always is, by the rest of the group, in this case, each exercise was witnessed by 18 other people, the Zoom environment creates a sort of fly on the wall experience, which makes it much easier for students to lose that self-consciousness that can still pervade a live studio space. The familiar environments that the students working in their own spaces allowed them to develop a closer attention to detail using their own actual possessions and stimulants, own real chairs, own jewelry, own pictures, plants, etc. And that imparted to them the potential for genuine significance and meaning. They still have to endow those spaces because there's a time element involved usually, but it sort of should make the transition a little bit easier, perhaps. And the notion of rehearsal for the students took on a different feel. There wasn't a need to create the space. In most instances, it was already authentically present for them. So it would be in their kitchen or in their living rooms or in their bedrooms. I want to talk about some of the problematics that I discovered through this. And this was, really interesting for them, obviously. And I have to say, I must pay credit to all the students. They all worked extraordinarily hard on this project. They brought real dedication and huge commitment to each of the exercises. They were a very dedicated group of students. But when I try to evaluate it, the first observation I would make is that the conflation of the professional and the private space in this exercise. Initially, it was problematic. Very often students appeared in their night clothes or their dressing gowns, or even would arrive eating breakfast or lunch, which they would never do in a kind of studio space. So we had to get some etiquette into the space. And that was quite interesting, not in a kind of schoolmasterish way, but in the sense that their relationship to space, and if you're actually going into their homes, they behave as though they're at home. They're not behaving as though they're in a workspace. So we had to clarify that for them. This exercise is extremely dependent on the actor's powers of imagination, creating physical, emotional, and imaginative belief in a set of given circumstances and a particular environment at a given time. And I would say that whilst the Zoom location allowed for the actuality of the space to be represented, it possibly did so at the cost of limiting an imaginative process. So that sense of investing and endowing and creating a belief, there was perhaps less of a need for that as experienced by the students, because they felt they didn't need to do that work because they were actually in their room. Whereas if you actually take it into a studio, they have to engage the imagination straight away. Unlike Uta Hagen, Lee Stroudsburg always said that he preferred, well, I don't like to use the word mind, but he wanted to imagine objects and props, and sometimes showers or imaginary teacups and hairbrushes, etc. And his argument was that if you gave student actors the real possessions, it cuts off the imagination. Now, I know that Uta Hagen would disagree with that, and I fundamentally disagree with it inside a theatrical kind of space. But in a Zoom space, when those objects become your own objects, I can see that there is a limit to the extent of the imagination in terms of the endowment of something takes place. And for me, endowment and use of space is very central to this kind of training. So although the Zoom space provided a really interesting authenticity, it provides a problematic relationship to the actor's use of real objects. So I would say that in the Zoom sessions, the reality of the objects, all of which were real, felt as though they diminished the imaginative process. The fly on the wall effect was very helpful in some respects, but the liveness of theatre, for which this exercise is a preparation, felt somewhat lost. The ability to actively create and work with a fourth wall, which is part of the training for this exercise, which is an important part of the development, disappeared from this exercise in quite a significant way. The students didn't really need to think about it because very often they would position their laptop in a discrete place in their room where they just completely lost aware of it, sometimes within 30 seconds. And from the point of view of observation, I mean, that's one of the reasons I haven't shared one of them, because you're often going into students' private spaces, and there is a kind of ethical dimension to the work that, you know, at such an early stage of the training, you can't train it. But their loss of self-consciousness was great at one level, but there is also underlying that, and Stanislavsky is very clear of this, an awareness of the fourth wall or the fiction of the actual. It's not actuality, it's a theatrical truthfulness that the exercise is working towards. And the proximity between the performer and the spectator on Zoom is different, and consequently produces, I would argue, a less immediate experience for everybody, for the spectator as well as the actor. There's a couple of thoughts I just want to bring in when I've reflected on it and tried to draw some conclusions. I'm reminded firstly of the French film theorist André Bazin, who in his work talking about photography and about film, talked about or uses the image of a picture in a gallery and says something along the lines, if we look at a realist painting, we appreciate it in its own terms. We appreciate the artistry, the craft, the constructed nature of the work, and the perspective that the artist brings to the work. It shows the way this particular artist views the world. The thing that we don't do when we look at that painting is expect from it to be a window on the world. We're not looking out through a window to see something realistic in that sense. And my sense of theatre is that's exactly how it works. When we look at a theatrical performance, we shouldn't be looking for actuality. We're looking at a representation of life as it is, or as we want it to be, or as the playwright or the creator imagines it to be. And this feels quite relevant to me when I think about it in terms of this exercise, because I think it blurs those boundaries. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I'm just interested that it does seem to blur those boundaries. When you're looking at students in their own spaces, recreating their actual 15 minutes, and there's a loss of that sense of the imagination, or it's not so obvious, it points to an interesting question. So for me, I think there's a risk that the Zoom space can potentially conflate a picture gallery approach with the window on the world. And whilst it's not necessarily a bad thing, I think it does raise very important questions in theatrical training about the role and function and engagement of the imagination, both of the actor and the spectator. The other thing that I'm reminded of is the famous incident when Chekhov himself visited the Moscow Arts Theatre, and one of the actors in one of the productions, I think it may have been Ivanov, I'm not quite sure, told him that during the play, frogs croaked backstage, dragonflies hummed, and dogs howled. And what for, apparently, Anton Chekhov is supposed to have said. And then after a pause, remarked that the stage is art. In one of Kramskoy's genre paintings, he has some magnificently drawn faces. What if we cut out the painted noses from one of these faces and substituted a live one? The new nose would be real, but the painting would be ruined. And again, I'm not imparting a value, I'm not making a judgment about Zoom, but it made me think about that in the sense of how we work on Zoom as actor trainers needs to be mindful of the questions that we're asking of the students and how we talk about notions of imagination, authenticity, engagement, presentation, awareness, endowment, really, really important.
2 minutes,
so
David.
For me, 2 minutes, did you say? 2 minutes, very good.
Minutes.
Yeah, okay. And the other thing that I was prompted to think about is that the process of theatrical training, and even in the context of this, which is not ostensibly marked as performance, even in a studio environment, it is very much creates a laboratory workspace. But for student actors and others watching it, the spectator achieves a sense of empathetic engagement through the imaginative process of the actor. And just going back to Stephanie's presentation, we believe in the embodied experiences that are represented to us. And there is that conscious awareness of how there's a thought or a sense, something internal takes shape in our physical lives, and how that animates us and animates our relationship to space and animates our relationship to the given circumstances. So I suppose the final thought that I'd leave you with, at such an early stage of the training, and these were literally semester 1 acting students, the skill of representation via an imaginary process is absolutely fundamental to the development of a secure technique and methodology. So, and whilst we certainly got a lot out of the Zoom sessions, and the students, I have to say again, worked incredibly hard, my initial expectations of it as a medium through which to teach these classes was a little bit confounded by what they do, or what the medium does to the notion of imagination in young actors who you're trying to get to transform and invest in imagined circumstances with imagined real things in imagined space, in imagined time. So lots of it was very good, but overall, I mean, I might write a piece about it. I feel that there are significant questions about this approach to these exercises in a first-year actor training program.
Thank you, David. So I can see we have some time for questions. I can see there's quite a lot of interesting conversation going on in the chat. I'm seeing people connecting with each other, networking with each other, which is, of course, fantastic. If we cannot meet face-to-face, it's good that we have these platforms for us to still network, for us to still share. Just 2 pointers, there has been in the chat some references to Sonia Moore. So thank you, Stephanie, for raising that. And the contribution with Sonia Moore made to the transmission of Stanislavsky's techniques. There has been also some other entries in the chat which have underlined what David referred to as an ease and intimacy from the students, as something which they have also experienced when teaching online. I would like now to go to the questions. There have been some questions coming in. And the first question is for you, Stephanie. And this is from Andrea Wright, who is asking if you could maybe perhaps expand a little bit more on this idea of beats or bits per page. What was your meaning there?
Hi, Andrea and everybody else. So I teach all levels of acting. I teach from complete beginners, general education, acting level, up through advanced acting. And even for actors with some experience prior. So first of all, many of you probably know that the term beats that Stroudsburg used is actually sort of a mistake, because Stanislavsky was saying bits, and with his strong Russian accent, it was heard as beats. But I personally continue to use the term beats, even knowing that it's not pure Stanislavsky, because I feel like I use beats in a number of different ways. First of all, when I'm first training them, I have them just separate the topics that their characters are talking about. And I find that that's the easiest way for them to get the concept of there's this, we're talking about, so, you know, I use a scene from Streetcar to first teach it. And, you know, at this moment, it's all about Blanche flirting with Stanley to try to get him to like her, and him trying to find out where she put the money, but she's doing it in all these different ways. So the first part, she's flirting trying to arouse his senses. And the second part, she's flirting, trying to get him to imagine her naked. And then, you know, there's all these sections. And so what I find is that if we mark the beats early on, and they're really just like sort of, it can be just starting out marking the topics. And depending on how that goes, like in the scene that I use in Streetcar, which is part of where in scene 2, it starts out and it's pretty much a beat every 2 lines. Blanche initiates something, Stanley shuts it down. Blanche initiates, Stanley shuts it down. So it feels kind of like an old car trying to start and it doesn't get going until it gets into the topics that he wants to talk about, and then the beats become a little longer. So, but when I mark the beats, then I have the students say who's initiating it, so they understand who's initiating the action, who's responding to the action. And also I have them name it, so that it helps them learn the lines through the sequence. But then when I'm working on telling the novel, or working on really anything in detail in the scene, having them work only a few beats at a time, I find helpful, because once they've done that series of exercises of the telling the novel, which involves 2 to 3 parts for each one. So for inner monologue or inner dialogue, 2 to 3 parts. For tonal subtext, 2 parts. For action, 3 parts. Once they've done that through the 1 page, that's like 6 or 8 times they've gone through that section, they know it. They've learned the lines connected to what the character's thinking, connected to what the character's physically doing, connected to how they're trying to affect the other character. They've learned the lines in this integrative way. And so, you know, they're very connected. So I don't know if that answered Andrea's question, but okay.
Yes, perfect. And the next question, I'm directing it to David, and it's being asked by Philip Bennett, where basically Philip is asking, what attention do you pay to voice and speech? He's saying that he has found it valuable to emphasize clear enunciation and speaking with fairness without the need to project as we would do in the studio. So the question is, what attention do you pay to voice and speech?
Thank you very much, Stefan. Okay, so I should make it clear that in this particular exercise, in the solo object exercise, there's no use of voice or speech at all. The students are in isolation and they're working and they're self-reflecting and they're working within a monologue. So there isn't any sense of social engagement either with themselves or with any other performer. But obviously, as part of the training here at WAPA, in common with all drama schools really, there's a lot of attention paid to vocal training and speech training so that the instrument is ready to be able to use in lots of different contexts. I am aware, both here at WAPA and at the Manchester School of Theatre, that both voice and speech have been reasonably successfully taught online, and feedback from students has been very positive, and dialect work has been taught very well online. In terms of projection of the instrument, I think there's a limit to how much you could actually deliver. I think you can do some really basic stuff in a Zoom space, but ultimately you've got to work quite closely, because much of that sort of training, especially in the area of voice and speech, is bespoke training, and you need to get to know each individual student's voice well to be able to diagnose and highlight good points, etc. I hope that answers the question.
Yes, David, we have time for one final discussion. Almost, it's a bit of a general question, which Bella is posing to everyone and to both of you. And Bella is saying, Bella Merlin, that I'm beginning to wonder, worry almost, if my students are going to be less interested in theatre acting post-COVID, post-Zoom, given how the truly live interaction with an audience is both invigorating but vulnerable and scary. They already seem rather more interested in TV and film, and she's wondering what might your thoughts be on that. Stephanie, if you want to go first.
Sure. Hi, Bella. I'm so glad you're here. I've found that my students are hungry for contact. So, you know, I mentioned that I'm working on a film, and the film is has involved just this incredible, powerful sharing. And I just know that in my classes, when we come back together to do the kind of ensemble work that David had mentioned, they find that connection so incredibly powerful. And so I think that we can use this to develop a kind of a confidence and a internal vividness within them that then they will be full of to sort of explode into the studio. You know, I work in all kinds of non-realistic styles, bringing in Stanislavsky as well. I just find the students are hungry for movement, they're hungry for contact, and that I'm not that afraid of it. And I think that the isolation is making them even more so.
Okay, yes, I'll jump in. Okay, so thank you, Bella. That's a really great question, a really, really good question. I'm glad you're here. So my initial response is we have to hear a call to action. I absolutely think in this COVID world, we have to really defend theatre spaces, live performance spaces. And I think we have a responsibility, all of us, to advocate for their resuscitation, to keep them going, to keep them strong, and to keep them vibrant. For me, my experience of it, I am very much a theatre animal, and I have full respect for acting on camera. I've got no issues around it. I do perceive that contemporary students associate authenticity and realism and the sense of some kind of true engagement as being much more appropriate to a camera environment, to a film sort of environment. And I think one of the dangers that this Zoom world opens up for us is the possibility that students will forget that realist, authentic connection in a very powerful aesthetic has full flight and full expression in a theatre. And as a result of the working with the first years on the solo object exercises, I was talking to some of them the other day because they're now back at school. We're trying to find some time when I can get them back into the studio and start all of that live, forceful, dynamic, energized theatre work, because there's a different notion of truth and authenticity that works in that. And I'm slightly concerned, and in my limited experience, I've only taught one acting class on Zoom, I'm slightly concerned that they might confuse those two things. And I think we need to keep them separate, find the points of contact, but also really underline the importance of the artistry of the theatre maker and the theatre performer.
Thank you, David. Other questions which are coming in, which unfortunately we do not have time to tackle. So we've had questions about how do you work on creating the world through all the senses? That would have been a question to Stephanie. Then we have another question if in the end Zoom is better suited for this sort of hyped up reel and the direct cinema movement rather than for a more poetic concept of realism. And we also have a question about, could you give an example of working on endowment of object, please? And another comment about the distance between the actor and the device. So there are still other comments and questions that are coming in. And of course, we can always discuss further via email and through also our own personal channels and networks. My sort of concluding thing would be that we are all, or most of us here, are all theater people, or we are all performing arts people. So what are we used to do? We are used to go in the studio and experiment. We are used to go into the studio and try things out. We are used to going in the studio and play. And if we can take this experimental attitude, this experimentation, and take it in the online world, I think there is some good results that can be achieved with this training. If you are feeling anxious with online teaching, I felt anxious with online teaching. I did what I always did. I went in online and experimented, and I felt that was helpful. Would you like to say one concluding point, Jonathan, before I wrap things up?
Just to thank David and Stephanie for a fabulously stimulating hour. Like always, it's just the conversation is just beginning to get going, and you just feel like we could be here for a couple of other hours. But I know that David's probably hit about 3 o'clock in the middle of the night by now. That would be unfair. So great start to this, a really potent debate, and I look forward to having more conversations.
And same thing from here. Thank you, David. Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you, Jonathan, for organizing this together. And of course, I look forward to meet you on other webinars organized by the Stanislavsky Research Center. You'll be receiving a recording of this in the next few days or so. So thank you very much and stay well. Thank you.
Thank you all very much indeed. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you. Okay, we did very well. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.